everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Educational Standards Today, bringing early childhood, Common Core state standards, and career and technical education standards into focus. We appreciate everyone joining us today. Before we start the program, I'm just going to review a few housekeeping items to get us started. We will be taking questions periodically throughout the presentations as we review each set of these standards. So go ahead and send in your questions as they pop up, and we'll put them into the queue to be answered throughout the presentation. We'll also have a little bit of time at the end, so can answer any questions that may have come up that didn't get answered during the first round of questions. To ask your question, use the question feature that's part of your control panel. Type your question into the top box of that question feature and then click on the send button. I'll receive it, and like I said, I'll put it in the queue to get answered by our speakers. We will be providing you with a recording of the webinar as well as a copy of the PowerPoint slides, so keep an eye on your inbox for a link for those later today or tomorrow. Now let's get started. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers, Gina Faulk and Larry Johnson, from EdGate Correlation Services. As General Manager for EdGate Correlation Services, Gina focuses on business development, maintaining and growing an excellent team, and offering the highest level of technology and customer service. Gina has 20 years of experience in print and digital publishing. Prior to working at EdGate, Gina held the position of Business Partner Manager at Learning.com, where she managed partnerships and the state curriculum adoption processes, which taught her just how integral it is to have a deep understanding of educational standards. Prior to working at Learning.com, Gina spent over 10 years at Macmillan Publishing Solutions as their U.S. Sales Director, forming key partnerships in many publishing sectors, including higher education, K-12, professional, trade, legal, financial, and government. Gina is joined today by Larry Johnson, who is the Client Relationship Manager for EdGate. Since joining EdGate in 2004, he has developed a very deep understanding of educational standards so that he can help clients understand how content will interface with them and their products. Larry brings extensive teaching experience to his work, including 30 years of curriculum development and 24 years managing science departments at several schools. Larry has also taught geology at the college level for 22 years. Larry has a BS in geology with a chemistry minor, a BA in education, and an MA in education and technology. We're very excited to learn from Gina and Larry today. They have a lot of information to cover on these different standard strands, and we're also going to be looking at what the Every Student Succeeds Act, how that may impact standards as well, as best we can. So I'm going to turn the program over to Gina and Larry, and we'll get started.
Thanks a lot, Emily. We're really pleased to be presenting today. So we're just going to give you first an overview on EdGate really quickly. EdGate was founded in 1997. The core of our business involves aligning content to educational standards for over 250 active clients, and those are mostly consist of K-12 publishers. We have a proprietary taxonomy that we've created over the years. So it's really a blend of our staff and our tools that are used to create the correlation. We also license out tools and products to do the correlation work. And we have a product called Curriculum Matrix that we won't cover today, but basically the Curriculum Matrix is a repository of open educational resources that we've aligned to standards over the years. As I mentioned, we are monitoring standards throughout the United States and internationally. We monitor over 1,800 subjects. They're all all their associated state standards. Our focus, again, is on providing the high-quality correlations, and we use a team of approximately 30 subject matter experts to do that. All of our staff members have an education background, so we staff ex-teachers who have now moved over to EdGate and are working in the private sector. Over the years, we've aligned over 4 million pieces of content. So it's just an ever-growing repository of standards. We're up to, I think right now, 3 million standards in our repository. So it's constantly growing, constantly changing, and takes our full-time staff to make sure that all of our standards are up to date. So I'm going to pass it over to Larry to do a quick history of the U.S. standards.
Yeah, and you know, it's when you dig into the history, there isn't a lot of actually documented stuff, so it was an interesting research project for me. But it was kind of interesting to note that in 1635 was the first public school, which was located in Boston. It was Boston Latin School, and at that point in time in the U.S., the curriculum was really heavily that of England, because everything had come over with, as part of the colonies. And so there weren't standards per se, there was curriculum. And the curriculum was what was taught and tested against. And it wasn't until later on in the late 1800s when they began to recognize the need to differentiate in assessments, to differentiate between what was being taught and the specific tenets of the curriculum that the students needed to actually be able to carry with them. So that was sort of the beginning of actually differentiating between curriculum and standards. And in the U.S., it was a very quiet period, shall we say, in the early 1900s with World War I, World War II, and then post-1945, things really started kicking in gear, where more focus on education, more focus on higher education, higher meaning above grade 8. And so by the 1960s is where we really, K-12 education really sort of got set. And that helped with the different organizations like the National Education Association and the different teaching associations across the U.S. Those different organizations were instrumental because it allowed teachers from different regions to collaborate better. And so all of this pattern was the segue into what we now see as our standards, different from curriculum. So it's kind of interesting that we started out with curriculum, one curriculum in a school, and from that we have now come up with one set of standards per state and multiple curriculums to address those standards with students. So it's just been an interesting evolution, shall we say.
Okay. So today we're going to start with the early childhood education standards. On the Head Start site, there's actually a pretty cool timeline that outlines, starting in 1964, especially in 1965, that's where it really started off with early childhood education when Johnson declared the war on poverty. And a part of that war on poverty was to create a comprehensive child development program that would help communities meet the needs of disadvantaged preschool children. So that really kicked it off, and you can click on each of these years and see the funding go up and down and up and down. So if you have time, you can check that out later. We actually pulled up the first set of Head Start standards that were created in 1975 and had a good chuckle reading them over. But for the most part, a lot of it has stuck around, but they really were a reflection of their time. We found things like, make sure that students had adequate access to working sewer systems, and premises were clear of hazardous quantities of lead. So it was really a reflection of its time. But these first performance standards were detailed guidelines for children ages 3 to 5, and it was really Head Start's idea of establishing performance standards, and it eventually spreads to the Federal Standards Initiative for Public Schools. So when looking at these Head Start standards, the original version was really written with a parent and teacher in mind, as opposed to listing the skills that the student needed to achieve. Now, you fast forward, and where in 1975 it really covered nutrition, social services, parent involvement in education, now there's a list of skills that a student, that are focused on the student and what they can do. So as we'll talk a little bit more about, the social and emotional development, approaches to learning, literacy, writing, etc. So just some quick facts and figures about early childhood. The Head Start standards were recently updated in 2015 for birth to 60 months. States use the National Head Start standards as their foundation to create their own sets. At EdGate, we align to the Head Start standards as well as this individual state's early childhood standards. Early childhood, we consider ages 3 to 5, so 36 to 60 months, and then the early years, the 0 to 18 months, I believe, are the infant and toddler. And only 42 states have the infant toddler standards. So in prepping for this presentation today, it was actually a good opportunity to talk to our correlators about, what is different about correlating early childhood content to standards? How do you go about it? Do you use a different approach than when you correlate content for the later years? And it really is a different experience because you're working with those social and emotional standards. And so you have math, science, social studies, language arts, and social emotional all in one set. And the social emotional is really the piece of the puzzle that ends up, in some cases, where you have to be pretty subjective. So that would probably be the key challenge. As you'll see in this slide that, we found that one early childhood activity can apply to a huge number of standards. So for instance, as we said, every lesson in the whole curriculum could cover curiosity and persistence, or we find that actually none of them do. So when publishers come to us and say, I want to try to meet every standard, that can sometimes be tricky. So the important thing that we found is really working closely with publishers and making sure that we understand their content well enough to do that, and having an open line of communication to do the correlation. There's an amazing number of standards that have to do with Cheerios, for instance. So we found a long list of, express choices with actions or simple language, choose Cheerios or a cracker. So, and there's many more. It's surprising how many there actually are. But whereas correlating to math and science, it's really straightforward, where you're actually looking at sorting, letter recognition, patterns. When you're talking about social and emotional, you have to think a little bit harder about how the content can actually correlate.
And just as a side note on that too, is everyone's interpretation of not only the standard but of use of the content also varies, and so that's the dynamics that we work with our clients in navigating that interpretation gray area. Right.
And the next slide about infant and toddler standards, what's different about correlating infant toddler, it really is that there's even a heavier emphasis on the social and emotional standards. So, there is actually an example of child manages actions and behavior with support of familiar adults. Well, what does this really mean? Does it mean they're sitting quietly while they're being read to, that they're letting mommy do yoga? Like, what does this really mean? So, again, we've got to keep that open line of communication to make sure that there is a good understanding about what's trying to be achieved there. Jody, any other comments on that one? No? And before we move on, Emily, if there are any questions about the early childhood standards, we can take them now.
We did get one question, and it is basically how seriously are pre-K facilities that are maybe not part of a school, so not Head Start necessarily, how seriously are those types of providers taking these standards and wanting to align to them with the curriculum?
Well, we're working directly with the publishers, and but we've seen a huge jump in interest in the early childhood education standards. Before 2015, the interest level was much lower. So, it's trickled down to us, I think. So what's happening with ESSA, what's happening with the new budget is eventually trickling out to us. We're seeing this huge jump. So as far as how seriously that type of organization is taking it.
Unless they're receiving funding, they're not required to use a set of educational standards. So if it's a Head Start facility, then they would be required to use a certain set of standards. Otherwise, you know, they're just doing headstands like they are in the picture.
Right. Excellent illustration. No, that makes sense, and I think you're right, Gina. Everything is trickle down, so there's more of an outcry in the market for it, so the publishers have to begin to make those correlations. So that looks like it for our question on this section.
Yeah, Emily did one more piece on that, is that it also depends on not only which state but which county, because different counties have different regulations for for little kid facilities, for daycare and things like that, and some will require some type of documentation as to an educational curriculum, and then others don't. So that part of their question is that it really varies. It just depends county to county, state to state.
Yeah, it's true of everything in education, isn't it?
Yeah,
it depends.
Great. And so Larry is going to cover where we are with the state academic standards.
So, you know, the word I tried to stay away from in here really is the Common Core state standards, because really in modern day today, moving forward, most states don't really want to even reference that word, because they've all incorporated whatever they're going to incorporate, whether it's all, some, none. They've already done that into their own state standards. So we're back to where we were, in that each state has their own individual set of standards. 44 or 45 states basically in language arts and math have the Common Core, but very few want to actually come out and publicly say that. So while the text of the standard is there, they may change the numbering on the standards, or however they want to
rebrand them, change the name,
rebrand it. But really, the whole movement of, in the big picture, the whole movement of the Common Core was to facilitate the U.S. moving to more common ground in standards in the core subjects. And as probably the whole audience knows by now, that only happened in language arts and math, even though the original intent was all four core, the social studies and science as well. And so, for the most part, it was successful in that they've done that. And states that adamantly refuse to adopt the Common Core standards, actually, when you look at their standards, you know, they've actually done a pretty good job of doing that anyway, but just branding them as their own. And so moving forward, we don't really think about that. And we just think that they're state standards. And there is a lot of commonality among them. And there will be people that will probably refer to Common Core standards probably for decades. But for us here at EdGate, we just view them as state standards. And so I think that part of it, moving forward, I think is important, because it takes, if you remove that, it takes any type of political connection or emotional connection out of it. You know, it's just, these are our state standards, and let's move forward. And so I think that actually has been a good thing. There are states that, you know, up there, yeah, we want these, but then we also want some of our own. And so that's played out. And again, we have 50 states plus DC, so 51 sets of standards in the U.S. that are all unique, which is where we were before. The difference is that all these standards, they're more closely, they have more commonalities now than they did before. We still have the huge range where some states will have, for example, maybe 3,000 science standards. and then other states might have 300. So there's still a huge variance among states, but at least I think the U.S. is coming closer. And when I say closer, I mean closer to the rest of the world. I'm looking at a bigger picture, because if you look at most other countries, they have one set of standards for the country. Throughout Europe, a couple of exceptions have been Canada, which are like us in that they have individual standards for each of their provinces, and Australia, which has individual standards. But recently, in the last few years, they've come up with their ACRA set of standards, which is their version of having a common set of standards for all of Australia. And that met with similar resistance, similar to the U.S., but Australia's moving forward with it anyway. And so, worldwide, I tend to see that pattern in standards is a movement so that students, wherever they are getting more of common ground when they graduate and get into the workplace. I was in Dubai last year, and their set of standards, one of their concerns is that their students, when they graduate, they come to the U.S. to go to college. And their failure rates out of the initial year of college was not because they weren't smart, but because they weren't prepared well enough in languages, particularly English, of course, in the U.S. And so their movement is to better structure their standards so that students can, in our today's world of, you can be anywhere, anytime, virtual schools, you can take classes from anywhere, and it needs to be a better common ground for students, no matter which university or which course they take. There needs to be some common ground, and I think standards are moving in that direction so that students have a better playing field, a little more level. So that's been the focus, and I think we're getting there slowly. But wheels of education, they turn slowly, as we all know, and so we just have to be patient. But I think we're moving in a good direction. And one of the common, speaking of the language, in the language arts standards, or English standards as they're referred to elsewhere in the world, there's 6 main sort of tenets, if you will, or sometimes referred to as anchor standards, but there's 6 basic categories in which they feel the master of that language needs to be focused. And when this was done back in 2009 and 2010, as I mentioned earlier, the original intent was that the same would take place in science and social studies, but it didn't. And as a placeholder back then, they took the language arts standards for the non-fictional, informational reading type standards, and they just wordsmithed them to fit as literacy standards for science and social studies. And those have stuck, and a lot of states incorporate those so that kids are reading. Unfortunately, they only did them for grades 6-12, but it's still, again, a step in the right direction, I think. And then in math took a different approach. Rather than having fewer focus domains, and that is more plays better with language arts anyway, math went to break their components up into 11 different domains, they refer to them as. And these play out throughout the K-12 range. So even elementary kids are going to be doing some things in geometry and so on. And even the math has been subject to a lot more change than the language arts standards, in that there has been more of a push to incorporate the Common Core the common math standards, these 11 domains, but incorporate them more into the more traditional roles of a math course, like algebra, geometry, algebra 2, trigonometry, problems, statistics, and those courses, rather than having it spread out over a whole set, there's a push to make it more compartmentalized, like it is taught in schools, and the way it's approached in universities as well. And so in Appendix A, they created an Appendix A, and those of you that do math, I'm sure you're well aware of that appendix anyway, in which they associated the different domains, which standards within those domains were part of algebra, and were part of geometry, and were part of statistics, and so on and so forth, so that it would fit, schools could fit these domains into their actual courses they are offering in school. So that, again, I don't think it'll go back to the old structure, but I think this, I imagine, will continue to be refined in the next 5 years as they experiment and find better ways to integrate the domains within the courses.
And on that note, Emily, if there are any questions about the state standards, we can take those questions at this point.
We do. We have 2 questions that came in so far. And one was when you first started talking, Larry, you mentioned that states were allowed 15% additions but could not remove any. What does allowed mean, and did states stick to these guidelines?
Yeah, that's a great loaded question. So here, the reality of it is that yes, they said that, but states, I think one of the states actually petitioned for 25%, and they said, fine, go ahead. But there was never any follow back as to what was the 15%. What did you actually do? There's been no, that we know of, there's been no posse, so to speak, that has actually said, yeah, these are actually them, and the ones you changed, these are the ones you changed, and yeah, that does fit within 15%. I don't think that's ever been done. I think it's been on the honor system that if the state says they're going to do that, then they did it, and everybody's trusting that they were honest about it. So I don't have a definitive answer for that because I don't think one exists.
You haven't seen anything outrageous in the changes, though, nothing.
No. I mean, yeah, the biggest part of really the states that said no, we're not going to, and then they miraculously, we've adopted new standards this year, and you look at the new standards, and they are, in fact, those same standards that they said they weren't. So that's the biggest piece that is almost comical that we see. But as far as the nuances that they have added to them have been minor, and there hasn't been any negative side to it that we've seen.
Okay. As you had mentioned earlier, there was some rebranding going on. Same thing, different package. Okay. And our next question is about how you at EdGate do things. So I'm going to just read this one. It's a little bit lengthy. What approach do you take to aligning to ELA, anchor standards, and math practices, particularly when your client has materials for grades K-12? Do you align each and every content unit which touches on an anchor standard, or look for overarching connections across the grades?
Okay. So one is they mentioned anchor standards. Now, in most conversations, the anchor standard implies then the upper level, the top level standard, like reading or speaking or writing. And we correlate to the lowest level of the standards. So we do have some clients that want that representation at the upper level to the standard, but it really, as far as accountability of the content to the upper level, it isn't very definitive, because a lot of lessons would correlate to an upper level anchor standard, but should really only correlate to specific targeted ones at the lowest level. So it is typical in language arts that there are 3 levels. So there's the anchor or top level, like writing, and then there's a second level where it's maybe research or maybe paragraph or language, and then there's a third level that drills down deeper and targets a specific skill or concept within that anchor. And that's where the true correlations lie, are where in those targeted standards, the lowest level ones. And that's where we do our correlations, although we can roll them up to the anchors if a client wants. But in my opinion, then your statement of that you correlate becomes sort of vague, because any lesson in reading would correlate to the reading anchor standard, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't define where in that anchor standard it correlates. And so that's sort of the rub. And when we work with several states on their bids for like RFPs and so on, and what the state wants without exception is they only are interested in that correlation to the lowest level. They want to know where in the content that this specific lowest level standard is addressed. And so that's where our focus has been, is because that's where the standard is, and that's where the Department of Education's actually need curriculums to address, is that lowest level.
Great, and we actually got a reply back that you have answered her question beautifully. So I think we are ready to move on.
Great.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, now we're going to dig in. We're transitioning over to CTE. So just going to give a quick background on CTE. This is a fairly new subject area for EdGate. We've only just added the CTE standards in 2015. A little history. In 2008, the National Association of State Directors of Career and Technical Education Consortium, really long acronym, they created the National Career Clusters Framework and Career Pathways. So you'll see in the left-hand side, those are all the 16 pathways: finance, law, manufacturing, etc. In 2012, the CCTC standards were created. And this was built on the National Career Clusters Framework to create benchmark standards, basically. So states could choose to use these CCTC standards, or they could go and develop their own CTE standards based on their state's economy and their own personal needs, state by state. So this slide, I think, really gives a great picture of what we're dealing with state by state, and I couldn't include all the states because I couldn't scrunch it into this one slide, but EdGate just added all of the CTE standards for each state, and it was amazing to see state by state how different those standards look. You'll see, for instance, that Virginia at the very bottom has 129,000 standards and 408 courses, where up at the very top we've got New Hampshire that only has 45 courses and 1,900 standards. So it's just a huge difference in what each state has done with those CCTC benchmark standards and how they've expanded them or not. Also, when we looked at the states, we found that what courses they created it was really dependent on the state's economy. So, for instance, in Florida, there's a large number of health science-related courses, and that makes sense because historically Florida has been known to support a large number of retirees. So the thought being that preparing young people to care for its elderly population makes sense for that state. In South Carolina, for instance, we saw a focus on architecture and construction, and then when we dug a little bit further, we found that, well, that makes sense because South Carolina is listed among the top 10 states that people are moving to. So it's logical that you would think about preparing students for their state's growing population. So we've got a lot of information. There's actually an interactive map on the EdGate website where you can click on a state, and we're kind of doing it state by state. So you'll click on a state and be able to see, you know, did they adopt the CCTC, or are they building their own standards, and what do those standards look like? On this slide, the example I really wanted to show here was that there are California CTE standards trying to explain animal biology and reproduction. But when you look at, you compare California and then you compare the Texas, and it's trying to teach the same concept, but it looks different. So one of the challenges that we've come across is getting a good team of correlators in place that can do that. And at first we thought, okay, well, we need CTE correlators, so we'll hire a few CTE correlators. But there's no one person that could possibly know everything there is to know about agriculture and construction and health. So what we've come up with over the past year is that we really need a team of CTE specialists. So everyone has their own niche, just like we do with academic standards. So we have our ELA team, we have our science team. The same goes for CTE. There's no one single person that can be amazing enough to know about the reproduction cycle of a cow and know about nursing skills. So it's really a good experience for us to do this over the year and to build up this huge repository. And as far as we know where these, oh, you want me to go back?
That's okay.
Yes, I can go back, but I have to do it this way.
Oh.
Let's see. I think we're here. Yeah.
So I just, sorry, Gina.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to point out that in addition to all that Gina's been saying is if you look at the cluster count, you'll see that like New York only has 7 clusters out of 16, and the national set, the CCPC, the national set has 16 clusters, and that's normal. That's the normal full broad set of clusters, and then each cluster is broken up into its pathways. But you can see by looking at just the cluster count, the standard count, how it's just huge differences between states in what they value and what they've included. So New York only took 7 of the 16 clusters, and they only have 21 courses out of those 7 clusters. So probably each course typically would be a pathway within that cluster, but again, each state, creates these things as their economic needs are, and so it's just such a huge arena. It
is, and adding these CTE standards alone to our repository, it added 500,000 standards. So it's a huge amount of data, and the problem is every single state is creating these CTE standards in a different format. So some, it's a PDF or it's a Word document, and they're not following the same numbering. And so for someone to go out, especially for the publishers, I can understand how difficult it must be to try to understand all these varying sets of standards and the various formats and numbering schemes they have. But it was a huge project for us to go out and do that. So I was talking about the challenges, too, about correlating. And, first was putting together had to build a team to do that. And then the other thing that we found is that states have, as Larry was saying, varying levels of specificity. So some states have written standards for every single career imaginable, whereas other states are, don't have as minutely detailed as others. So that was something that was interesting to find out. And we also found 2 types of CTE content. So there is career research content that is providing a general overview, more like statistics, how well it pays, how to prepare in general if you decide you want to pursue that career. And then there's career training content that we see, which is really in-depth preparation for a specific career under the assumption that the student has already decided that this is what they want to do in life. But what we found is that a larger portion of the CTE standards, state by state, are really focused on the latter, the career training. So, for instance, Texas actually has 2 career education standards that if you look at Chapter 130, they have career technical education that has 75 courses on career training, with only, in their Chapter 127, only 5 courses on career research. So it was almost like we were looking at content that was trying to do two different things, and standards that are really trying to do 2 different things. So again, a good learning experience for us, that there are really 2 ways to think about CTE, the research and the training. So at this point, I'll stop again, Emily, if there's any questions about CTE.
I think we're all set with this set of standards, or people are overwhelmed by it, one or the other.
Okay.
Or maybe both.
Yeah, or both.
So looking at ESSA's impact, ESSA is the bill that was signed in December. And honestly, we really haven't felt a lot of the impact on ESSA yet, but we feel like there will be, again, that trickle down that comes to us. Right on the ed.gov site, though, you'll find this little graphic that talks about how ESSA will hold all students to high academic standards, prepare all students for success in college and career, and provide more kids access to high-quality preschool. So you can imagine that there is going to be an effect on standards eventually.
Yeah, and you know, the big question everybody has is, okay, how are they going to do this? And is there going to be funding? And that sort of overrides everything as we go into this ESSA black hole.
Yeah, and the timeline, as we illustrate on this slide, is an 18-month transition period with everything actually being implemented at the beginning of the 2017 and 18 school year. So then we looked at ESSA and each of the areas that we talked about today, starting with early childhood. And will ESSA make any changes from prior law related to early childhood standards? Across the board, ESSA did state that it will meaningfully support state and local efforts to strengthen standards alignment. ESSA includes authorization of the preschool development grants, which again we feel like will trickle down to the publishers, who will then need to create more content, a curriculum for students in that preschool age range. The law states that providing early childhood education programs is an allowable use of Title I funds, and then below that you'll see that Title II dollars can also be used to do teacher training, professional development. The ESSA report is over 1,000 pages, so it's for fun. You can go and check it out, but I just try to pull out key points so that we could talk about those today. I did go in and looked at the fiscal year 2017 budget, and again, a huge document, but you can see right away that there is funding, and again, this is the proposed budget, so who knows what will happen in the next year, but as it's written right now, the proposed budget does include this mandatory preschool for all initiative that would invest $75 billion over 10 years to give more kids access to high-quality preschool and full-day kindergarten. So again, you can imagine that there will be curriculum that will be needed for those full-day kindergarten programs and the preschool programs. There is also $9.6 billion slated for a Head Start. So, and the goal here would be to increase the number of children participating in full school day and year Head Start programs. So again, keeping in mind this is the budget request. Looking at how ESSA and academic standards, how academic standards tie into ESSA, what I found in looking at ESSA was that it really maintains the prior law. It preserves the state's authority to have control over the content of state standards, as Larry was talking about today. They must demonstrate that their standards are aligned to entrance requirements. The only change really came up having to do with ELP standards, so the English Learning Proficiency Standards. There is some language in there about that it adds a requirement that these standards address different levels of English proficiency, so some states may have to revise their ELP standards. And then support for academic standards in the budget, what I found is that there was $15.4 billion for Title I grants, and that has to do with developing state-determined college and career-ready standards. So we were talking about that just this morning. You know, what does that really mean? And states already have career and college and career-ready standards, some of them, but not all of them. So this really means that states need to start creating them if they don't have them, using them if they're not using them. But again, it goes back to preparing students to be college and career ready in the end. So there is budget in there for these CCR standards that really relate back to, as we were talking about, the ELA and math.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, and you know, the commonality among, if you were to go up to a, you know, if you're orbiting Earth and you're looking at the really big picture, then the pattern has been that, you know, the CCTC for the national set of standards, states are using that as a starting point to incorporate their own. So they're using that, adding their own, very similar to, you know, what happened with the Common Core initiative. They took those standards and then they incorporated them and they're using them as their own, building on them and so on. And same for the early childhood. There's the National Head Start, and then they're using that as a guideline and then building their own. Mm-hmm. So it's the same, you know, overall pattern. So we see clients that like to correlate their content to the national standards, because it is a segue into then each of the different states, whether they have them or not. And so.
Yeah. Going back to ESSA and CTE, does ESSA make any significant changes from prior law? This one, there's a lot of information about CTE and ESSA. The answer is every state must develop challenging academic standards that are aligned with relevant state CTE. CTE is really now being treated as a core academic subject, and CTE is included in the definition of a well-rounded education, along with your basic subjects like math and English. And it's really worldwide, too, that we're seeing the interest in CTE. Larry, I know that we were talking about the National Curriculum of England, building in computer coding standards. So it seems like throughout the world, it just makes sense to bring CTE into the core academic standards and subjects. There's also information about career readiness indicators, that states are encouraged to use more career readiness indicators in their accountability system and state report cards. There is information about the new allowable use of funds under Title II will support states developing strategies for integrating career content. And again, Title II funds being used for PD to train CTE teachers. We did find a great deal of support for ESSA and CTE from the advanced CTE group, who were applauding the fact that that it's breaking down these long-standing silos between CTE and academic programs. CTE that was kind of previously considered as vocational, it's kind of now getting the respect that it deserves. And the Perkins Collaborative Resource Network also applauded the plans, and sort of the same thing, it's support for integration of academic and CTE coursework. Although there is information out there about the Perkins group also stating that there is a lot in the proposed budget and in the ESSA, and there's might not be enough funding. So that kind of goes into our next slide. There is funding for CTE in this proposed budget, as you'll see here, but a statement from ACTE stated that, you know, we applaud what's happening here, but we continue to emphasize that CTE programs rely on Perkins cannot be asked to do more with less. So, huge movement towards CTE, but how the funding will shake out is an unknown for us at this time. So that is our last slide. So if there are any questions about ESSA, we can take those now.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Gina and Larry. You both did a wonderful job covering a lot of information in a little bit of time. So as I mentioned earlier, everyone will get an email with the slides and the recording so you can go back and look at what was covered and review it. We do have a couple questions that came in. Before I get to those, I do want to thank Gina and Larry for taking the time to do this for us today and provide you with all this information. They've got their contact information up on this slide, and I also would encourage you to go to that website and sign up for their newsletter as well as look at the blog information they have. They provide a lot of really great, timely information about what's going on in the world of standards, so that's a good resource for you to sign up for and get. So we'll get started with the questions and get through what we can. So we had a couple questions from folks that I think are getting at similar things, which are basically how many standards do publishers generally align to? Do they pick just one group and go with that, or how do you go about picking what standards we're going to tell folks we're aligned to?
It really starts with the subject, doesn't it? So when we receive content from publishers, we start by looking at, what subject are we talking about? And is it science? If so, it's science, it's going to the science team. But then when you evaluate it on the science team, Larry, then you're also tying in, well, actually, there are some different, there's a whole evaluation process that we do. So there's really not a set number of standards sets.
Yeah.
But
it's more of publishers come to us with more of, we want to correlate our content to standards in the U.S. So they're not picking necessarily a subset of standards. They want us to be able to make available to them the ability to run reports or to show on an interface, a web interface on their website, how their content does match with Alabama standards or grade 2 language arts Tennessee, or middle school CTE in Utah, which developed quite a number of their own CTE specialty courses. So the larger that, with that in mind, so the larger, we have some clients that have literally tens of thousands of pieces of content that we have correlated over the years. So they would correlate to millions of standards across the U.S. And if they have international standards, they would be included as well. So I don't know if that answers that person's question or not. I don't know.
Well, I think that's a good start, and certainly if we need some clarification, feel free to ping us, and we'll ask for clarifying details from Gina and Larry. Our next question is back to Common Core. So, and you had mentioned that you're not really referring to it as Common Core anymore. For publishers, should they still have a block that says we're Common Core aligned, or really just have all 50 states listed separately instead of a couple years ago we just had here's Common Core?
Good question.
Right. Well, it's really up to the individual publishers, because it's how they market their material. So there is still in existence, and will be, I would imagine, for quite some time, there's going to be the national set of Common Core standards for both math and language arts. So that could be a reference tool for them to just the national set if they want, and that way it doesn't step on any individual state toes that are actually have the Common Core but didn't want to admit it. So you don't so no, I'm being serious. I'm not trying to be facetious. So it allows them the ability to still label it if they want, But I think my personal suggestion is if they're referencing individual states, I would reference them as that state and not Common Core. And then you don't have to walk that potential chasm, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah, the sort of negativity that has grown up around that.
Yeah, and it's really unfortunate, and it was completely evolved into a political football rather than an academic one, and that was the sad part about it. But that is humans, so there we go. But I think having a reference to the national sets is always a good thing. And then if it's there for people that want it and not. The same with Head Start. Even though states have their individual early childhood standards, I think it's wise and to reference that here's the national Head Start standards, and we also have the individual state standards, so that they're kept separate, but they're both available.
Yeah, I think that makes sense in a good way to navigate that.
Yeah.
Our next question is on CTE, and so it actually comes from a math publisher, but I think it applies to other subjects as well. Do you recommend, or are you seeing a trend towards these traditional core subjects trying now to bring in the CTE standards? Does that seem like a smart strategy?
We're thinking about that one.
Yeah.
Okay. No worries.
Yeah, we do have. I have one client in mind specifically that is eager, I would say, to have their content available as CTE as well. And when you look at CTE, the big overriding picture of it is that, okay, so in any one given course in real life, let's say a construction engineer, they have to know certain science tenets, and they have to know math, and they have to, incorporate even financial and management, and they have to incorporate all those things into that one, if you will, CTE pathway. And so it's really a combination, it's an integration of a lot of different subject areas. And Gina was talking about that earlier, that's one of the challenges of CTE is to find people that can navigate all those different disciplines that we're used to being compartmentalized. Compartmentalized. I knew I was missing something. And CTE is really striving to integrate all of that together, and it's and that's part of the challenge. And so I see that as funding becomes available, maybe through ESSA or just through other career avenues, that we're going to see a push from our clients to help them bridge that gap into CTE from their existing content, and that's going to be a challenge.
Yeah, it certainly did, looking at that chart you posted of how diverse those are.
Yeah.
Well, we have reached the end of our time, and coincidentally, the end of our questions, so that just worked out beautifully. So thank you again to everyone at EdGate, and in particular, Gina and Larry, for joining us today, and thanks to everybody in the audience for taking the time to participate. As one just final reminder, you will get an email later today or tomorrow with the link for the recording and the PowerPoint slides, and you'll also find those posted on the agile-ed.com website. Also keep an eye out for our next webinar, which is going to be on ESSA, because it's a hot topic right now. We're going to be joined again by Steve Rowley from Acumen Partners. That's going to be coming up in May. We're still confirming the date, but it will be either the 18th or 19th. So keep an eye on our website as well as your inbox for more details on that as well. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Bye.